Hello, YouTube. How are you guys doing?
We're out of time. We live dangerously through it all. But after fight, we tried and we tried. Ignited a spark, it grew into a flame that exploded into shattered dreams. Our love ripped apart and there's no one to blame. Trying to forget these broken memories. I try to shake the feeling tonight. Wanna wash it all away and start a new life. Is it time for me to leave the past behind? I wanna stop breathing, I wanna stop believing. Rise into the sunlight. I just wanna shine on the inside and the outside. I wanna stop breathing, I wanna stop believing. I just wanna rise.
Alright. I think we could go ahead and get started. Let's see. If any of you guys, by the way, have any projects that you're working on and you would like to do something like collaborate, mutual referral, that sort of thing, please do feel free to reach out. And I think this is part of what it means to refine our project, refine our craft. And this will tie in with the topic of the stream today, specialization production. So every individual only has so much time to specialize in whatever they do. And well, I mean, this this is part of what makes each individual unique. Oh, we're being joined by a friend, George. What's up, George? So I think that one valuable thing us fellow internet users could do is to find each other and what we're good at, and collectively, through linking and referring and all these things, we could be better than Wikipedia. So what Wikipedia does is it's supposed to be this aggregated consensus about the state of the art for any given subject. But I would say that whether it be your home city, maybe a particular food you like to cook, and so on and so forth, I think that if you really get to know and understand something, and then you read the Wikipedia, then Wikipedia suddenly becomes a lot more personal. You could see how it isn't just a collection of facts, but it's oftentimes a quite subjective take on stuff. Perhaps one say exception to this is maybe like mathematics or something that's pure theoretical. But then even with that, you could ask, like, let's look statistically at the proportion of different articles. Why are there so many articles on this one mathematical subfield and not on these other subfields? So even with something like math, which will say, oh yeah, math is objective in the sense that if you say something about math, you could show the proofs and all that, whether something is true or not. The human aspect, even for that, comes out in that with math, we could see what are the topics that are given more attention, less attention. Who are the mathematicians that are presented as like geniuses, presented positively? Who are the mathematicians that go unnamed? So even for the understanding of something like mathematics, right, there's always a personal aspect to everything, right? Like, if you tell me today I'm going to become a mathematician, I think that a pretty natural question would be, how, first of all. Now, what do I mean by how? Well, Do you mean that you're going to go to graduate school and rise up through the ranks of being a mathematician? Or do you mean that you're going to be like a mathematician hobbyist while working a day job as whatever? Um, what do you mean by I'm going to become a mathematician? So, even for something like math, which someone might think of as something that's relatively objective, then the way that it's presented, for example, through Wikipedia, there is necessarily a very personal aspect to it all. Anyways, that's a long about way of saying that I think one valuable thing that all of us could do as, uh, let's say, normal people, non-bots, non-bots on the internet, how do we mutually support one another? Because clearly there are a lot of bots on the internet. Places like Twitter will have a lot of bots. I'm sure YouTube has a lot of bots. Even on this channel, like we're an extremely small channel here, but we've dealt with bots and spammers already. So looking at the internet, and thinking about metrics such as comments, likes, engagement, whatever you want to call it. It's this weird kind of fake democracy in the sense that a lot of content will get featured or upvoted, whatever the mechanism is called. But it is not clear that people actually like this content or support it. Rather, you get a lot of people that, or I won't say a lot of people, you get some people that are willing to game the system, so to speak, using bots, maybe a lot of sock puppet accounts, having their own little influencer network where it's kind of tit for tat, scratch my back, I scratch your back. So I'm not even saying that these things are good or bad, but I think that it is important for us all to recognize that this is the climate that we're operating in. Whereas, for example, you could not have a radio show just with a bot. Well, I'll step back a couple steps. Like if you had a radio show that just played like queued up music, I suppose you could have a radio show that just runs like a program as bots. But in terms of having actual call-ins and stuff like that, it would not be possible. However, it would be those shows where somebody actually has an experience remembering, oh yeah, I called into the show and I talked with the host about this and that, or oh yeah, they had this really interesting guest on such and such show. These are the things I think that really stick with people and make people return to things. Whereas if you have just a kind of one-off event like this account posted one interesting thing once, if you're doing a purge of the people you follow and stuff, such a channel I think would be ripe for the purging. Anywho, long way to say, yes, I think that on the internet, a lot of us are specialists in many domains. And one of the problems with specialization is that a specialization, it could be really lucrative. It could pay a lot. But it's contingent on somebody wanting to have somebody in your specialty. Now, if what we're able to do is value each other's specialty, then suddenly you're not worried about just some impersonal force valuing your specialty. Rather, it's like, oh yeah, this is my friend that really knows about such and such. So if I have questions about it, I could ask them. And maybe because you know that you have a friend that's interested in something, you're looking around wherever you live for, like, I'll just give the hypothetical example. Let's pretend you have a friend that's really interested in cooking Thai food. Well, then you know that, for example, you visit a Thai restaurant, you take a picture of the menu, you send it this friend, you could say, oh, how does this menu look? What do you think of the Thai food here? And so on and so forth. So you could have like a real personal experience with a lot of things. I think a lot of our lives could be very enriched through rebuilding and having these personal connections that I think are lost a lot of the time in the modern world, especially as a company may expect you to act in a certain way, to follow just a very bland kind of program. So our rebellion, so to speak, I wouldn't even call it a rebellion. Let's just say our after hours effort, our side gig, right? Having projects and ways to connect people in different ways, I think could be a very positive way for us to make the best use of internet technologies going forward into the future. So, yeah, that is all for that. All right, let's return to stream topics. So, okay, we're gonna soon get into Jacques Ellul, but I think some starting blurbs on specialization are appropriate. So I just gave an example of like practical things that we could do to support one another. Now I want to talk about how the powerful people are able to use specialty to their advantage. So let us turn. I pulled up this webpage here. This is from the Xa Li website. His article here is titled Tech Geekers versus Spammers. So let's take a look at what this says. So if anyone's not familiar with this comic, Spy versus Spy, just do a quick search. You'll probably be mildly entertained for a bit. So recall that Spy vs. Spy was a popular comic by Antonio Prohias that appeared in Mad Magazine. So why do I bring up Spy vs. Spy? Well, as this Xa Li article features, we could have various teams. Tech geekers, that's a phrase Xa Li likes. I think more generally you could say like hackers, this kind of thing, versus spammers, which I'll call like people trying to game the system. Maybe another party to add to this is that the so-called tech geekers, they could come in multiple flavors. I mean, oftentimes I would say that they're establishment adjacent in that they're like hackers. I think they call them like white hat hackers. You're fighting against cybercrime and all that, whereas like the spammers, they would fall under black hat hacker, people that are trying to go against the current order to disrupt things. Now, okay, so we'll use white hat and black hat because Spy versus Spy. There's the white spy and the black spy, so it's appropriate. So what I want to highlight by bringing this up is that both the spy and the spy, like they're two sides of the same coin, yin and yang. It's like they're both spies. Is one the good guy? Is one the bad guy? Well, essentially they're doing the same thing to each other, and they're in this constant battle. So let's read this paragraph that Xa Li wrote describing them. Let's see. The theme being two arch-anemic spies, colored one white and one black, who better each other on schemes and technologies. One creates a voice recognition missile, then the other invents a voice exchanging device. The final frame of the comic would have the second spy shrieking with mirth and a victory pose over the mishaps of the other, turned into the next installment, and the winner and the loser are reversed. We see one spy excitedly plans a booby trap When he enters the other spy's house to install the bomb, he got blown up because the other spy has spied on his scheme. Again, the hilariously smug victory pose over the misfortune of the other. Their fight is endless. Over and over, read with glee over the silly stratagems and incredible technologies they devise that befall on themselves. As I sit here and read the technology geeky morons fighting with the spammers. So the context of this is kind of funny. So Ksal Lee, a friend of mine, but also the author of this very popular website, ksallee.info, which he authors. One of the things I really have enjoyed about his site is how he will give just his take, a personal take on the development of technology and internet history. So Spy versus Spy, I think Ksal correctly points out, is often a description or a symbol. It follows the same pattern as what we see in the tech world between various parties. So he describes it as technology geeky morons fighting spammers. I think another way to say it would be white hat and black hat hackers. But what's crucial here, I think, is that the two spies, as your job, if you're a spy, right, you're able to do things that normal people aren't able to do. So if you're James Bond, 007, right, James Bond is licensed to kill. That's his famous thing. So let's look up James Bond and see a quick description of that. Okay, so there's the movie License to Kill, but let's just look at James Bond generally. James Bond. Oh, by the way, so all these James Bond, very influential movies, still going. They're by this writer Ian Fleming. So Ian Fleming, interesting guy. He was a Fed, right? Was a British writer, journalist, and naval intelligence officer. So how would he know about all the Fed topics? Well, if he was a Fed himself, then yes, he offers like an insider view into how a lot of stuff works. Anyways, James Bond, let's see. License. Okay, I can't find the exact text I'm looking for, but I mean the main idea I'm trying to convey is that James Bond is allowed to do things that other people are not normally allowed to do. So you watch a James Bond movie, a lot of guns, a lot of violence, a lot of killing. These are things that I do not recommend for you to do, and as I'm assuming everyone watching this is just a normal civilian. Well, I take that back. We have some military people that drop into this stream from time to time. So, okay, if you're a civilian, then you're not allowed to. You're not licensed to kill. You can't do all sorts of stuff. Whereas if you're in a particular position, for example, as a secret agent under the government, then you are allowed to do all sorts of stuff. In the same way, we look at Spy versus Spy, and we see, right, if you are a spy, and in the realm of cybersecurity, all these sorts of things, you are also allowed to do all sorts of stuff that normal people aren't allowed to do. So, for example, if I said something like, oh yeah, the China tried to hack Google in such and such and such way, then pretty much any American would not be surprised by this, because they would say, oh yeah, it makes sense to me that China or Iran or North Korea or whoever is attacking the United States. Now, I could ask you, let's say you don't like, you have a friend on the internet or an enemy on the internet, someone you don't like. Are you allowed to launch a cyber attack on their website? No, it would be a crime in the same way that you can't just go and like literally bust in someone's door. These are things that are illegal, and furthermore, you shouldn't do in general. Anyways, the mystery though of the spy versus spy, James Bond, all this secret agent business is these pop culture things. They get the public interested or watching or kind of fascinated by a world that they are not part of. It's like, black spy versus white spy. What is this whole world of feds versus hackers, tech geekers versus spammers, whatever the party that you're naming. But as an individual, you basically have one of two options. You either join them and actually get involved in all this stuff, or B, you're just a passive bystander that's witnessing all this stuff as entertainment. And another word I would say is it's kind of it's kind of a waste of time. It doesn't really do much good for you to give more hours than is necessary for analysis to look at this stuff. Because if you have other things to do, for example, suppose you have money problems, right? Then instead of watching feds fight hackers, right, then why don't you go out and look at a way to earn some more money, right? So you could better provide for your family or whatever it is that you're doing, right? Yet James Bond, tech geekers versus spammers, spy versus spy, all this stuff is pushed at people from a young age to encourage them to be fascinated by this world that the vast majority of us will not directly become a part of. So is this their PR? Is this their propaganda? Is this these two groups trying to sell the public on the image that they're kind of heroes? In this way, it's similar to the whole superhero stuff. I'll add this to the list of topics to talk about another day. The superhero phenomenon. Superheroes. But we could think of tech geekers versus spammers, white hat versus black hat hackers, all this stuff. It's a kind of a little bit closer to home fantasy to the whole superhero thing. Only it's like, oh yeah, the good guys in our government are protecting us from the bad guys in that government. Oh, and yeah, if we don't have nukes, then they'll have nukes, and then we're done for. And, this whole cycle of which I think solidly accurately despites as the fight is endless. Over and over, we read with glee over the silly stratagems and incredible technologies they devise that befall on themselves. So when you're watching the news and doing all this stuff, right, it's like getting you sucked into this loop where these things out of your control. How do you benefit? What does knowing about all this do? Like, how does it help you? In what sense is it useful? And that's popular culture for you. That's what's presented to people to focus their attention on. So, right. Okay, so let's bring this back to the specialist topic. So I relate this and I bring this topic up with a discussion of specialists because to be like white hat, black hat hacker, whatever it is, it involves becoming a kind of specialist. Oh, sup, Reaper? We are joined by another viewer. Okay, so to become like a cybersecurity person, whatever you call it, like if somebody is sitting in their basement all day, like working on computers trying to hack people, obviously they're gonna have the opportunity to become better at this art than someone who works the majority of their day as a gardener or something like that. Because right, they have more hours to put in to learn the specifics of all these tools, things like that. It's like being a soldier, a cyber warrior, a cyber soldier. So you become a specialist, and then you're at the service of a particular party to do what they asked you, right? So James Bond, secret agent, what does he do? How is he allowed to do certain stuff? Well, he's given a mission from headquarters, from the top or whatever, and then he's given the tools and whatever to go out and accomplish that. So in the same way, right, we are given a lot of this entertainment, spy versus spy style entertainment in our daily lives, though the forms that it takes have evolved over the decades. And yeah, I mean, I think lot of politics, a lot of stuff follows a certain pattern where you're kind of watching a spectacle of different parties duke it out. And yeah, this adds to, well, say, so with spy versus spy, right, it's kind of known that you are not able to do anything about their conflicts. They just do what they do, you know. And in the same way with like international politics, right? Could you yourself actually vote on how the U.S. treats China or China treats the U.S.? No, not really. There's nothing you could do unless you decide to become a diplomat or something. Then maybe you have a say. I actually have not investigated how much personally people that are involved with that have as a sway. But a lot of these people, right, they're not elected people. They're selected some sort. So I think tying in with spy versus spy, then the whole mythos around the vote, the democratic processes, all this stuff, then this is offered as a kind of antidote to all of this chaos that is going on. So you have spy versus spy. Oh, what's my role in it? Well, one of the reasons that the vote is supposed to capture people's attention, and people say, oh yeah, you know, what was the best thing that happened? Well, you know, women got the vote. Oh, the voting age was lower. All this stuff about the vote. Why is that significant? I think it's because it offers this supposed outlet to this whole spy versus spy stuff. So it's like, are you allowed to say, oh, I like black spy more than white spy, or white spy more than black spy? Voting, even if you are not directly involved in the actual activities that these different parties that are dueling it out do, then voting offers to people a thing to believe in, such that, oh yes, you know, I cannot do much, but what I can do is select who is my representative, right? I could choose who gets to be black spy and white spy, you know, maybe through many layers of separation, but it's this idea that people will be satisfied and value this mechanism that they're given as a proxy for them directly being involved in a lot of stuff that's going on. Oh, cool. We're joined by Xali himself. Yeah, I'm showing off your excellent Tech Geekers versus Spammers page here. Yeah, if you're interested in learning more about democracy and republics, then one of my favorite Xali pages is the Xali Palpatine portrait of a perfect sociopath. Where did it go? Here. So we'll just read Xali's little blurb here. He says, Palpatine, the master salesman, watch carefully his intonations, the way he pauses his speech, and every nuance of his facial expressions. At critical points he turns and examines carefully his subject's reactions. So, interesting thing here. Yeah, I'll save this for another stream. This whole thing of analysis of Star Wars, the so-called light side versus dark side, all this stuff. I think it relates to the spy versus spy stuff in the obvious light versus dark kind of way. But this might be an interesting topic to explore further. Anyways, Kasali movie, Palpatine, interesting page, as well as Tech Geekers, and you could read about history of Silicon Valley and all sorts of other stuff. Cool things. All right. So with that being said, let me just bring this full circle again and just summarize why we launched into these various topics. So I opened up this stream just talking about YouTube business and specialization and how, right, as specialists, we could help out each other by, as George puts it in the chat, making a kind of web ring where we value each other's specialties and skills. That's number one. Number two, the whole spy versus spy thing I want to highlight as a manner in which certain specializations are offered to people, right? Like, you might not be interested in doing the NSA's bidding. Maybe you're more interested in classical Chinese or something. But often the time, the manner in which the specialists, the most high-powered people for a certain subject are able to do what they do is because of state sponsorship and these sorts of mechanisms. And I'm not saying that, not making a libertarian, libertard argument that government is bad, but just to say that oftentimes people are only able to become specialists in the capacity that for them to specialize is useful for somebody. So while individuals might develop specialty in various areas, they're only able to sustain that practice of really refining and deepening their craft if people are willing to patron them. And so my proposition is we should step out of the spy versus spy dialectic, and instead of just sitting back as bystanders and watching these different parties duel it out, right, we could be unified in plurality, and that we could all mutually support and see what different people among us are good at and throw off that extra dollar or whatever it takes in order for us to support each other, especially, you're making more money or whatever. What do you want the world to look like? Do you want everybody to work at Google or Microsoft, or do you have ideas about what would be better, right? And it's up to everybody in order to make that happen, even if you aren't throwing money at people, to even just give your approval or something of some idea, to take a little bit of risk, then this is very helpful. So George mentions Jonathan Peugeot. So, oh yeah, Jonathan Peugeot. What a cool guy. I'll put his name up here. Jonathan Peugeot. He runs I think a website, you could call it a network. It's called The Symbolic World. That I wholly endorse checking out Jonathan Peugeot and his work, because he is doing a lot of good things. And also, interestingly, I'll just mention this Jonathan Peugeot figure. He's embracing the NFTs. Like, okay, his day occupation is he's a icon wood carver. So as traditional as one might get in this century, carving orthodox icons out of wood, right? Not a digital salesman, whatever. His main thing is he does these very beautiful wood carvings. And but he's also a very, very intelligent, sharp guy who could see and doesn't ignore the advances and changes in our world. And so one of his latest projects is he made a graphic novel, and then also he launched like an NFT project. So it's like, I don't know if this NFT thing is going out anywhere, but since it's there, why not roll with it? It might be interesting. So I like this approach. I think we have a lot to learn from people like Jonathan Peugeot, who are like just very likable, productive, good people. So here, then one of my goals is to do a similar thing. Like there is this thing called YouTube streaming. Sure, there's scammy aspects to it. There's a lot of problems with it, but we could ask ourselves, right? It does no good to just hate NFTs, to hate YouTube, whatever it is. Instead, we could ask, right, how do we use YouTube? How do we use all these platforms? And I think that, like, for example, I don't really do much to actively promote user engagement or anything besides just telling people what I do. In the same way, too, it could be us that are able to make, like, meaningful social network type stuff on the internet, right? If we're like, we don't like Facebook, we don't like YouTube, we don't like ads, well, what is the alternative to that sort of system? And I think if you have, like, I like the word that George used here, web ring. We could bring up a definition of that. If we're able to, with the modern technologies, establish web rings, even if it's through YouTube or Discord or whatever means that we're able to do, then I think that this is a time-tested, viable way by which you could break free from a centralized control system. Rather than a centralized control system, you have just different rings. It's a natural way that people organize themselves. So let's take a look at what a web ring is. So here, a web ring is a collection of websites linked together in a circular structure and usually around a specific theme, often educational or social. They were popular in the 1990s and early 2000s, particularly among amateur websites. So the circle would be this person links this person who links this person, so it's a circle in this regard. Of course, we don't have to strictly be a ring, right, where we only link or promote one person, but if we're able to have a network where people are able to know who are the different people out there, what are their specialties, and take the same structure to YouTube, to Google Groups, now defunct, or was it Google Plus? I forgot what they call it. The idea that I'm emphasizing here is that there's something more powerful than the substrate, the technology itself. So, not a big brain word here. Let's look at what a substrate is. Okay, they're giving me pretty chemical specific definitions. What I mean is the technology that something's implemented on. So, you might have an internet social group. Is it implemented on static websites, on YouTube, on Discord, whatever it is, right? I think that there's certain patterns that work, and this is very high level programming in the sense that I'm talking about how people connect. Doesn't matter even if it's HTTP protocol or whatever. If we're able to continue to use and to recognize and use the models that work for getting the kind of results that we want. I think that that's how we make stuff better, through not just complaining, right, but having these mutually supportive networks. Okay. Enough ranting on those subjects. I'm going to turn over to Jacques Ellul, and if anybody has any comments or things to share in the chat, please run them by me, and I will read and respond to those. Otherwise, I think turning to the text is good, and I think that I have covered the main ideas I wanted to discuss here. Okay, I had one more thing in my description notes. I'll just bring this up very briefly, which is video games. So you could think of video games as the utmost expression of kind of top-down given to you specialization. All right, so objectively speaking, being good at a video game is completely useless. Like this is why it might be like, your mom says stop playing video games all day. Why would a mother say that to a child? Well, it's because you don't get anything done just being in this virtual world, doing, pressing buttons. And then somebody might point to like an esports championship. Let's search esports earnings. All right. Somebody might be like, "Oh, you're saying video games isn't a viable career? Well then, why did this guy make $7.2 million playing Dota 2?" And so on and so forth. So, video games, it is true. The top video game people, they do make money, just as like the top streamers and all sorts of people. But you could ask, right? With respect to video games, what are you actually doing when you're playing video games? How is a video game useful to anyone, to you? And the answer is kind of going to real theoretical economic stuff, and one could apply the same thing to cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, or whatever, right? Video games, they're valuable because some people say they're valuable, right? Video games are valuable because people put their attention, they put down real money, they put down all sorts of stuff to look at video games. So video games, you could think like favorite League of Legends champion, whatever we're talking about. This is kind of like Spy versus Spy in that you get everybody to focus their attention on this little game, and then maybe even to commit their own life, their own time to mastering this system that is not, they do not own that system. It is not a natural system, so to speak. It responds to rules that somebody else set up. And you invest heavily, you specialize in these things. Oftentimes it's a kind of winner take all scenario, yet a lot of people are wanting or willing to plunge into these worlds to try to get those rewards. So I think that the video game world, it's a microcosm. Microcosm might be a good word, or like a distilled example of the spy versus spy sort of thing, where you have a establishment approved game, basically, where people fight in a controlled environment according to fixed rules by the system, and it's advantageous for the people that control these games, the people that are creating these games, that these games do become popular, even if they aren't directly doing good for anybody, really. The people involved, there's going to be some winners, and that is enough motivation or enough impetus, whatever you want to call it, to carry these things forward and make a lot of people want to participate in these things, even though you just take a few steps back and think about it. It might be like, of all the things to do, is this what is really motivating me? Is it wanting fame, recognition, so on and so forth? You might find that your motives are not so good. You're getting high on a lot of hopium, trying to look at these things where if you aren't really going to be diving in deep to try to become one of the top people, I mean, it's not a very good use of your time, all things considered, in my opinion. Okay, let us switch over to Jacques Ellul now and look at how the Industrial Revolution, according to him, but I think generally we could accept his take is probably pretty okay on this, how the Industrial Revolution has really encouraged specialization to an extent and of a kind that has only been accelerated in modern times. So I'll start reading. I'm in the bottom half, page 55 on the PDF, page 55. So Jacques Ellul starts. In the middle of the 19th century, when technique had hardly begun to develop, another voice was raised in prophetic warning against it. The voice was Kierkegaard's, but his writings, solidly thought out though they were, and in the strongest sense of the word prophetic, were not heeded for very different reasons. They were too close to the truth. Continuing, this analysis applies chiefly to the countries where the technical movement first developed. England and France. So these are kind of quintessential Western nations, along with Germany to follow not too long after. In England, events took a somewhat different course than in France, but they had the same scope and profound significance. The historical sequence varied, but the orientation of both countries was toward technical development. Social plasticity developed in England by different paths and at a different time than in France. Sociological taboos were broken at an early date. The regicide, so killing of a king, of Charles I by Cromwell, gave the initial and primary impulse to social plasticity. As all writers agree, after this date, a rigid social hierarchy no longer existed in England. All right, this is an interesting point. So Jacques Ellul points out that regicide, so the killing of a monarch, was the beginning of what he calls social plasticity. So I assume by what he means by plasticity is like flexibility. So you might have heard the buzzword neuroplasticity. Let us bring this back to the current times and look up a definition of neuroplasticity really quick. So neuroplasticity is the ability of neural networks in the brain to change their growth and reorganization. These changes from individual neuron pathways making new connections to systematic adjustments like cortical remapping. Examples of neuroplasticity include circuit and network changes that result from learning a new ability, environmental influences, practice, and psychological stress. So stuff happens and your brain rewires. That's the basic idea behind neuroplasticity, rather than saying your brain is just fixed in a particular way. The hope, the promise in neuroplasticity is that because your brain has the ability to reorganize, reform connections, and so on and so forth, that a lot of the time we're being held back from our true potential, whatever you want to call it, because we're locked into some pattern. But if we shake things up in certain ways, then perhaps we could unlock new abilities. So here they talk about Cromwell and the regicide and social plasticity. So we can see the same pattern applying in politics that now we're talking about with brains. So with politics, it's like this. Society, it's rigid in the sense that you have a hierarchy with the king on top, and then people are kind of born and continue within their class. Like a blacksmith's son is likewise to become a blacksmith. I think that that's probably not a caricature of how it usually worked for most people. If anybody wants to debunk what I said, feel free to challenge this notion. But I think that, right, in a traditional society, people had kind of continued through whatever path they were given. And I think, right, like in the Bible, for instance, there would be the priesthood would often be passed through families. You couldn't just step up and say that you're a part of something that you aren't. So I think that these patterns have long been established in all sorts of parts. Anyways, so social plasticity is in the sense of, well, suppose you have people that look at the current order and maybe they are just a laborer, but they would like to be a manager, a governor, a philosopher, a king, right? Then you shake things up through regicide or some other thing, then maybe you could see what happens. So an equivalent to this with the brain stuff would be like through some sort of trauma, psychological stress, right? Trauma, stress, sensory deprivation, whatever means it is by which you do these things. A lot of this psychology research into stuff has come out of study of like shocks, sometimes literal shocks, but in other times, whether it be like a lobotomy or like some extreme condition that wouldn't appear naturally, then people are trying to understand how these various methods might help people to snap out of some pattern that they do not like. So with Jacques Ellul here, I think social plasticity is an interesting term that I think could be this the same sort of brain ideas, but with social structure. All right, continuing. The supreme value was productive and efficient labor, which permitted the industrious to rise high on the social ladder. William Pitt is a good example. The king no longer represented divine authority, nor was he able to resist the nation. No longer was there sociological rigidity based on the royal person or on the power of money. It would be an error to interpret sociologically the England of the 18th century in accordance with the stability that which is discernible in the 19th century and which was achieved after the technical revolution, when society had entered new paths. In the 18th century, England was essentially mobile and unstable in all its structures. Christianity itself was not the conservative force, proved to be on the continent. Two great currents divided English society before the advent of Methodism: the Church of England and the Puritans. All right, so let's pause a second here. George says he has to go. He says, see you later. See you, George. Thanks for joining. All right, back to the text. So, okay, so we have a kind of revenge of the nerds scenario here. So, Jacques Ellul writes, the supreme value was productive and efficient labor. So if you're a master of machines organized in factories, this sort of stuff, and the supreme value is productive and efficient labor, then that means the person that is able to optimize in some way, optimize output of widgets, whatever widgets might be, wagon wheels, sacks of flour, whatever it is, then that sort of person, they are usurping authority. They will rise to the top of this particular society because now there's social plasticity. So maybe before, like the money person, the manager, they would be below a king. They would be even below, like, let's say, aristocracy, which guarded the high culture of some kind. Now the nerds, the expert manager types, then they are able to rise to the height of the hierarchy, because the present society that was set up places a supreme value on productive and efficient labor. Okay, let's see what Jacques Ellul has to say about the Puritans. Ellul writes, the Puritans, even after their political failure, were the predominant influence. In keeping with the trends of the Reformation set, they exploded all prevailing religious taboos and developed a practical and utilitarian mentality. Ooh, utilitarian. Juicy word there. Let's see what more is said. So they developed this mentality that emphasized the use and even the exploitation of the good things of this world given by God to men. The relationship of this trend to the development of capitalism is well known. The Church of England had favored tolerance since the end of the 18th century and had adopted as its leading bishop Warburton's idea of social utility. So let's just quickly investigate this development of capitalism with the Protestants. So I'm going to look up Adam Smith, and let's see what sort of, is he connected with the Protestants? What sort of background does Adam Smith have? Alright, religious views of Adam Smith, known for his Wealth of Nations, right? Wealth of Nations is the famous work he did, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. So what sort of religious upbringing did Adam Smith come from? So Wikipedia states, considerable scholarly debate has occurred about the nature of Smith's religious views. Smith's father had shown a strong interest in Christianity and belonged to the moderate wing of the Church of Scotland. The fact that Adam Smith received the Snail exhibition suggests that he may have gone to Oxford with the intention of pursuing a career in the Church of England. Let's see. And then opinion of some guy, Anglo-American economist Ronald Coase, has challenged the view that Smith was a deist based on the fact that Smith's writings never explicitly invoke God as an explanation of the harmonies of the natural or of the human worlds. According to Coase, though Smith does sometimes refer to the, quote, great architect of the universe, later scholars such as Jacob Viner have very much exaggerated the extent to which Adam Smith was committed to a belief in a personal God. Xali says, Adam Smith, great, I think. Alright, well. Okay, so if it seems Adam Smith is not directly invoking a personal God, then think, what is he famous for? Like invisible hand, this sort of thing. So this economists of this era, many of them were interested in explaining economic systems, wealth as a sort of natural system, right? Just like, as I've shared, my background is in looking at linguistics and human communication mostly. Then similarly, the social scientist people that are looking at economics, right, they want to say, how is wealth built, right? Adam Smith's book, Wealth of Nations, these things, they're looking at how does money flow, and you don't need a personal intervention, or they're not looking at personal intervention in how stuff happens. Rather, they're trying to find naturalistic principles, right? Impersonal principles that govern, like, why would a planned economy work or not work? Or if you are trying to plan an economy, in what manner should you plan? This is another good topic. We could look at economic stuff and look at, for example, the Marxists, right? They've called themselves having like a scientific outlook on stuff. So in what sense do all these economist people say that they're doing science, and in what sense do they say that they're not? I'll just interject here that I don't dismiss and say economics is not a science. I'll put it like this. Like, my definition of science is being able to clearly see the cause and effect relationship of things, right? So economics has to deal with money and stuff like that. So do I believe that economics is a science? And I would say yes, I think economics is a science in the sense that you can have a better or worse understanding of, you do this and this policy, then this and this happens, right? We could systematically study, or maybe not systematically, but through looking at history and stuff, we could come to a greater understanding of what particular policies or ways of doing things give certain results. So I'm not anti-economist. I don't think all economics is bullshit or anything like that. Rather, though, I'm saying economics is a science, but I don't hold by like a very narrow definition of science as like empirical method in such and such ways. I understand science to be as the understanding of cause and effect relationships in the world, something like that. All right, so let's jump back to Jacques Ellul. So Jacques Ellul was talking about how the Puritans, various Protestants, had a practical and utilitarian mentality. I brought up Adam Smith just because he is a representative person talking about economics, these sorts of things. So maybe some aspects of Adam Smith's thinking were also shared by his contemporaries, people in England that were concerned about issues such as the wealth of nations, right? How do nations become wealthy? How do nations lose their wealth? So on and so forth. And it seems that a lot of these people, right, they were looking at, let's take all these resources, all these things as given. Now, how do we maximize or optimize for a particular sort of thing, as opposed to asking for supernatural intervention? Rather, it's just like making these machines. You aren't asking for divine help if you're just trying to devise and optimize a system yourself. Like, I'm sure some people do, but other people, they probably just try to figure it out themselves. All right, continuing. The Church of England had favored tolerance since the end of the 18th century and had adopted as its leading principle, Bishop Warburton's idea of social utility. Here, too, there was a kind of secularization of religion. Religion is no longer the framework of society, can no longer impose its taboos or forms upon it. Rather, it integrates itself into society, adjusts to it, and adopts the notion of social utility as criterion and justification. At the same time, the disintegration and atomization of English social groups occurred, brought about not so much by the influence of the state as in France as the destruction of peasant society, which began in the early 18th century and of which Defoe and Swift were such eloquent witnesses. So let me just relate this to a previous point made by Jacques Ellul. So we talked about the regicide and social plasticity. And then we could also see that as social plasticity was brought into the society, the disintegration and atomization of English social groups, think about the plasticity like this, right? Like plastic melts, and then you could form it into new shapes if plastic melts. So in the same way here, right, you melt society, you break up, you disintegrate, and the English social groups split up, right? Traditional forms were no longer. And then you might see the destruction of like various things that used to be, such as here it's mentioned the destruction of peasant society, right? You impose a new social organization, then of course a lot of the old structures are going to go away by definition. Let's see. Right. So along with the readjustment of how society was run, then also too, you see that according to Ellul, then you get a lot of different religious ideas. So everything about society is shaken up by lots of different factors and like people, actors as well, right? People trying new things. And then also from that, then you likewise see that people's religious sentiments or their views of religion change. So people no longer say like, what is my purpose in life? And they no longer say spiritual life, like finding God, something like this. Instead of that, they say, it's utility. Basically, how do I organize my environment and all this in order to have the most wealthy, prosperous life now in this world? Then naturally society and stuff is going to change if you change those goals. All right, continuing the text. The peasant commune and the peasant family were slowly ruined in the 18th century. The historian notes the collapse, relentless and more rapid than in France, of a whole society which had been in equilibrium until then. The struggle between the landed and the moneyed interests ended with the victory of the moneyed interests. All right, land versus money. Interesting contrast there, because I think now, I would say land and money, they kind of go together. That's why we talk about real estate. So this might be another interesting topic to look into later, relationship of land and money, because maybe they have been quite separate in past times. I do not know. Continuing, it is not important here to detail the ways a new peasant society based on the moneyed interest came into being. Newly rich entrepreneurs brought up the great estates and took the place of the old gentry, but that is not our concern. Our concern is the merchants whose influence changed the organic structure of the traditional world. Okay, so here Ellul is bringing attention to a particular class, merchants and money, and how that has changed a lot of stuff. Ellul continues, the small landowners and the yeomen were eliminated or reduced to an agricultural proletariat, or they were forced to migrate to the city. Oof. This is 21st century relevant. So small landowners and yeomen, right? This might be considered, your homestead, your small autonomous farm. All of this stuff eliminated or reduced. Let's add some spice. Bill Gates buying farmland. Let's take a look at this. Farmlandriches.com. Why is Bill Gates buying so much farmland? Oof. So as you can see, these topics, right? They're in the news today. About billionaires that want to buy up all the land, and their reasons that they would articulate for doing so is eradicate major diseases such as polio, malaria, and HIV, reduce child death by half across the developing worlds in Africa. All right, so this is probably specifically about doing stuff in Africa, right? End starvation in Africa, educate and empower smallholder farmers through mobile banking. So you get people hooked up in the same systems using the same sorts of tools, then they're not like a small farm that does things their own way. Rather, they're integrated into some bigger system. So, you reduce the landowners and yeomen to an agriculture proletariat, and they were forced to migrate to the city. So maybe a lot of people that previously had worked land, worked agriculture, now they've moved to the cities. They become bugmen, urban bugmen, among who I am chief. Urban bugmen. What are they? Oh, I'm intrigued. Metanomad.net, bugmen. What are they? Let's look at bugmen. Oh man, this is a whole blog. This guy's been writing since 2016. Alright, I can't resist. I'm going to read this paragraph about bugmen. Then we'll return to Jacques Ellul in a bit, but I want to learn about what Meta Nomad has to say about bugmen in 2017. Alright. What is it, bugmen? Aesthetically, they're much like their name. Bug-eyed. Jittery and insect-like. Their very demeanor often makes one's skin crawl. They're more than likely surrounded by hordes of these bovine-esque people in day-to-day life. Culturally, of course, they're near impossible to pin down, for they cut all cultural roots at the base in fear of representation with the past. Oh, so they're embracing the social plasticity. Interesting. Politically, many say bugmen are, quote, left-leaning, end quote, yet I'd argue the case that any affiliation with politics is entirely with the curve of the populace, and thus the bugmen at present inject themselves routinely with viral strains of progressivism, neoliberalism, and especially democracy. Projected from this ambivalent attitude towards history and politics comes anti-empathetical extroversions with regard to tradition, myth, folklore, spirituality, and interest, all of which are positioned in relation to a bugman are used only alongside heavy doses of postmodernist irony. Alright. The simple matter of fact is they have zero respect or tolerance for anything antiquated or traditional. The most minor or historic morsels that doesn't actively sell itself to them or project their personal vision of infantile tech utopia is cast aside. Philosophically, the bugman is relatively confused, often mistaking logic, reason, and rationale with one another, and replacing the idea of basic causality with their own drawn-out narcissistic assessment attempts. Quote, "Look at me, I've got it all figured out," the bugman says internally. Alright, so this interlude, very, very interesting. Bugman, right? So maybe with this plasticity, all this sort of stuff, we're seeing farmers, tradespeople, whatever, a lot of people being melted into urban bugmen believing in the tech utopia vision. Interesting. All right, let's continue. The rural corporations were ruined. The communes passed almost completely into the hands of the new landlords and ceased to constitute coherent sociological units. The movement was accelerated by the application of new agricultural methods, which were accepted much more rapidly than in France. So talking about Britain now, England. The enclosure of the commons, which in France took place chiefly after 1780, began in England in 1730. The new agricultural techniques were plainly so superior that it was not possible to preserve the old, quote, open field system, the commons, the pastures, and the forests. Thus the final blow was dealt to the old organic peasant society. The peasant could not survive as such, and with him the whole of society entered into a state of flux. So plasticity, flux, changes, all this stuff. The plasticity we refer to came about in England as a result of this evolution in the use of power, which furnished the technical movement with the necessary manpower, apathetic, vacant, and uprooted. So you want bugmen to fuel the technical movement. Not only was this manpower necessary for the development of industry, the masses thus created were indispensable to faith in techniques and the spread of techniques. So, just with this quote, I wanted to highlight this phrase, plainly superior with respect to the agricultural techniques. Now, I think now, anybody who even takes a kind of cursory look at agricultural stuff will be aware that issues such as toxicity, sustainability, these are very important topics that we now know in general society are problems with respect to agricultural stuff. So here, where they're like the new agricultural techniques were plainly so superior, could ask, how was it plainly so superior? Well, maybe with respect to a particular metric. So let's just say you're comparing two agricultural techniques and someone's saying, you do it with wheat and you farm it this way, then we get superior yields in terms of the grain, something like that. Then by that metric for that time period, you may have indeed found a method that is plainly superior. But now we talk about issues such as soil depletion. So just bring up article on soil depletion, right? So people will talk about soil depletion with respect to climate change, overusing the same fertilizers, all these things. So you might have an agricultural technique, get excited about it, think it is superior, but really it's just like if somebody like sprints, right, when they're running a race, and then they go faster than a marathon runner. Does that mean that the sprinter is the superior runner? Well, in the sprint, he ran faster than the marathon runner's average pace, but if that sprinter cannot sustain what they do, or maybe they'll hurt their knees and they'll only be able to do that for a certain amount of time, then the plain superiority of their technique of running is not so apparent. So I would say the same thing with farming and agriculture and stuff. A lot of methods, ways of production, things like this, they may have arisen and people might have been quick to accept them because they're like, oh yes, we could end starvation and poverty. But then you look at another, all sorts of different issues such as desertification agriculture. So when land was previously fertile and it turns into some kind of barren earth, right? So here we have an article from The Guardian. Says the expansion of dry lands is leaving entire countries facing famine. It's time to change the way we think about agriculture. And then here, the erosion of civilizations of the growing revolution, bringing our soil back to life. So we might have gotten really good at getting quick yields and stuff through certain methods, like using mechanized tractors, all of this sort of stuff. But what is the result of this, right? You search a term up like desertification, then it's like, oh, maybe this tech utopia that was promised, it's not as good as it was marketed to be. It was not so plainly superior once we take a longer time scale or start to look at other factors besides something like, oh yeah, just tons of yield for this year. Something like that. All right, let's just read one more paragraph or two. So Jacques Ellul writes, to summarize, social plasticity came about earlier in England than in France, and the technical movement developed along with it. Moreover, the state, which was dominant in French society, did not have the same influence in Great Britain. This applies, too, to the development of a clear technical consciousness. In Great Britain, this consciousness appeared as a bourgeois interest. The spirit behind the introduction of new techniques in the rural districts was very different from that which characterized France a short time later. The technical movement in France was launched by the monarchy and took a scientific form. The academies and the research institutes propagated the new techniques throughout the country, and the nobles applied them, very often disinterestedly. In England, profit was from the very beginning the prime motive, and empiricism was the dominant factor because technique was more efficient. Technique were developed because it paid to develop them. Commercial activity found them advantageous. This was true in agriculture as well as in industry. Alright, so it seems that going on in this work, then Jacques Ellul is probably going to contrast England and France, and I'm curious to see what he has to say about French monarchy, that sort of stuff. You know what? Let's continue. We're almost done. we'll get all the way to chapter 2. Let's do it. Okay, so I'll just continue reading. The English technical movement was marked by the fact that all the different financial systems, banks, stock exchanges, and insurance companies were perfected. The clear consciousness of the value of technique expressed itself primarily in terms of money and was located at the center of the systems of distribution. And the acceleration of invention in this area influenced all other techniques. The British state attained this clear technical consciousness at a comparatively last date, and then only when it saw the techniques were its immediate interests. Got a comment. Lasagna is good, says woohoo, final push. Yes, got to go the extra paragraph or two. Alright, continuing. This phenomenon of technical clarity sometimes came about through an association of the interests of the state and the interests of private individuals. Okay, so let's just pause here really quick and say a lot of ideas, and I don't know if Reaper is still with us here, but Reaper brought to my attention this fact of how governments, state, research, and technology have always been working hand in hand. So if one were to say, like, oh yeah, if we just let people to be free to tinker and do whatever, then technology would grow up in this wonderful and blossoming way. Yet we look at the history of stuff like the internet, DARPA, all this, Silicon Valley, all these things. Government grants, research, universities, all this stuff has always been tied together. So I think that it's probably in nearly all cases, it's probably a mistake to talk about how, government good, government bad, private industry good, private industry bad, even billionaires good, billionaires bad, right? Look at the entire system and see how particular ways of organizing things, right? This social plasticity, whatever you want to call it. How does a particular entire arrangement of things yield particular results? So here, right, interests of state and interests of private individuals, and it's talking about Great Britain. You could have state and individuals represented, but maybe not. Don't view that as a contrast between state versus individual, a state with individual even. Instead, look at, say, what sorts of individuals were able to prosper in this sort of system. What were the programs pushed by those individuals, and how was that useful? And I think that this is kind of mirroring Silicon Valley stuff-ish today, which is to say, is the system actually kind of set up for somebody like Elon Musk to succeed? So Elon Musk or somebody, they might paint themselves as, oh yeah, just I'm a really smart guy, engineer working in my garage. But then you look at the history a little bit more and it's saying, oh no, you got huge fat ass grants, and you come from a family that's connected with a bunch of rich people. And so this is all open history at this point, where you could look at the company history for places like Google, Facebook, SpaceX, whatever you want, and then you could look at how stuff actually became how big it was. So there's like the myth given to the plebeian, the normal people of, oh yeah, if you just become a bug man science genius, then you're suddenly going to ascend. Investigate that question, see if that is actually true, and instead you might find, oh yeah, well, it's certainly well-connected people that have certain projects that they want to build, and you'll see that certain projects are promoted, certain projects succeed. Of course, you have to be able to deliver a working project of that sort, but it's like people are asking and paying the big bucks for particular sort of things. So I don't know if Ksali is still with us, but like Ksali is an expert at a lot of technologies that basically has zero market value. So one thing that Ksali does is use this ancient text editor called Emacs. So he's very known as being a Emacs expert. He writes Emacs tutorials about this program, which probably a lot of people have not heard of. Now, even if Ksali, his knowledge of Emacs just kept on ramping up and up and up, and he was very, very, very good at Emacs, it doesn't matter. The world does not work. It's like you're really, really good at a thing that you're good at, therefore you get rewarded. Rather, certain projects, certain sorts of things are rewarded, and if you get good at something that somebody else wants to pay you for, well then lo and behold, you're probably going to be paid well for that. But if you just choose something that you like, right, that isn't in the lines with somebody else's wishes, agenda, whatever you want to call it, then fortunately or unfortunately, the way that stuff works is it's not going to pay. Now the consequence of that, of course, is this is true whether you like it or not. So one thing we could do for each other, and we'll bring this back to web rings and the beginning rant I gave to this stream, is if people are doing things that we want, they're dedicating the time and effort to become specialists and stuff, it's vital that we support one another, because you can't count on DARPA to support Emacs text editor. So if you want Emacs to stay around, and there's people that are devoting a lot of time to doing Emacs stuff, then do throw some coins, especially if you work at Google or something, then it's up to you to reallocate Google's budget to make sure that nerds that are doing the nerd stuff that you like are able to sustain themselves. All right, with that public service announcement put aside, let me continue the text here with Jacques Ellul. So Jacques Ellul writes, in steelmaking, for example, the fact that Henry Court was supplier to the Admiralty was decisive in 1780 for the application and development of steel puddling. The state found in this procedure an excellent means of improving its naval vessels. However, it was competition with the Napoleonic Empire that started His Majesty's government down the road of technique. Okay, Just briefly here, we can see a parallel with the U.S. versus USSR space race here, right? So it could be nobody cares about rockets or rocket ships or anything like that. Then the Soviets are like, oh, we got Sputnik in space, so we could launch this dog to fly around the Earth until he dies. And then the U.S. is like, you guys can't be the only ones that are killing dogs. We're going to land on a rock. So here we have a prequel to that, which is like Great Britain competing with France with respect to technology, these sorts of techniques. But we could see the same pattern played out again and again. And now, for instance, I would say we're starting to see like U.S., this U.S. quote democratic system work versus Chinese social harmony system. Who will win? It's kind of like a new cultural war that people are supposed to get hyped about, to say, oh yeah, U.S. model, including inclusivity and diversity and all that, allows people to innovate more and build better technology than those evil Chinese people that just want everyone to be the same. And don't even ask us about the Russians. They're the worst. So with that, we'll put the specifics of modern times and the different teams aside. But that's to say that what technologies get funded, what sorts of things that people are developing, right? Oftentimes it has to do with these power struggles, and you'll have the different parties that want to see more of one thing, less of something else, and all that. All right, continuing. Therefore, both governments, so I think talking about Napoleon and France and Great Britain, understood that only technical efficiency in all government relations and enterprises could command the paths of peace, as well as the affairs of war. Oh, Reaper says, as far as I can tell, DARPA and NIST, Natural Institute of Science and Technology, is that European? Let's see. Grants probably helped create TICO, so an old text editor, and Emacs. Who is NIST specifically? Where are they from? Reveal yourselves. Oh no, it was United States Agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Okay, so these are both America. All right, where Reaper's giving us some America First facts about how American funding and support led to the development of such interesting technologies as the TICO editor and Emacs. So good old retro computing here. Yeah. Oh, okay, so building up Reaper's point here too, I also want to add that within a country, right, you could have different competing agencies or forces, whatever you want to call them. And, they might actually be competing with one another. They might not like each other very much. Like in the U.S., we have both the FBI, the NSA, the CIA. You have all these groups. I think that it would be incorrect to assume that they're all lock and step, right? These are different groups, different parties that have different things that they want to accomplish. And like talking about the space race stuff, for example, now we have our billionaire superheroes. We have our Elon Musk versus Jeff Bezos versus the Branson Virgin Galactic guy, right? Who will win? Who are your favorite billionaires? So they're probably all trying slightly different approaches and doing all sorts of different things. So it's not even like a country or a region versus other things. Rather, we could see that there's always this competitive structure that is instrumental in driving technological innovation, whatever you want to call it. And Reaper says TICO and Emacs were developed at the MIT AI lab, which got tons of money from lots of sources. Okay, so Yeah, Reaper brings up an interesting point, which is talking about how. So now we hear about machine learning, artificial intelligence, all this sort of stuff. Reaper's talking about one thing associated with Emacs is this Lisp programming language that was important in artificial intelligence researches decades ago. So here, this article from '94, Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. It's talking about some network technology, interweb stuff, a distributed hypermedia. I'm gonna have to look at this article later. Anyways, Reaper's bringing up a good point, which is to say that from the outset, looking at these things, MIT AI Lab, right, technique, the development of this stuff, metaverse, all these topics are related, in that the forefront, the goal of a lot of the technologists has often been to increasingly automate more and more and more. That's why robotics, machine learning, AI, these topics are so important, because they represent the tipping point. Whereas you make the machines more powerful, you still need human operators. The AI stuff represents the end point, where you could literally just have one dude that pushes a button and then widgets come out of the widget machine, right? So for most things you can't do that yet, but we look at pro robot channel, car factories, things like that, that the people that have the most resources and stuff available, and especially with high-tech things like computer chips and cars and things that already have lots of automation in their processes, to have the AI stuff as the maximum level of productivity, such that the robots do all the work and the humans are free to make art or do magic mushrooms or whatever. That has always been one of the goals of a lot of people. Alright, continuing. The English state henceforth had the same influence on the development of techniques as the French revolutionary state had exerted through the establishment of a clear technical consciousness. The way had already been paved in England by the emergence of the British bourgeois. Whatever the differences in its development in England and France, however, the technical consciousness that appeared was identical in both countries. Okay, so maybe different paths arrive at the same conclusion. Continuing. In the United States, this took place at the beginning of the 19th century. Until then, the society of this country was inorganic. But at that time, the American social milieu was favorable. Moreover, the Americans profited from the technical consciousness evolved in Europe, and so they arrived immediately at a model for technique. Jourdian had noticed that the Americans began by mechanizing complex operations, which produced the assembly line. So I think Henry Ford and people are famous for that. Whereas the Europeans tended to mechanize simple operations such as spinning. The American accomplishment was the result of exceptional flexibility of the American milieu. Okay, so this is interesting because it's saying the Americans, they're thinking higher level programmers, not just making more efficient machines, but also what are more efficient ways to organize people, systems, and processes. So this is business science type stuff. How do you arrange organizations and things also to increase productivity? All right, Reaper says, given the open nature of Emacs and used by lots of universities in science and computer science, your original statement about Emacs not getting funding is probably inversely true. You're misrepresenting most AI research from 1950s and 1990s. It was a super long-term research concept. The people going into it were super academic science people, and there was not a large emphasis on some end goal of increasing efficiency. I mean, I would say just the very idea of artificial intelligence. Yeah, I'll concede that, right? Especially academics, people might have all sorts of reasons to look into artificial intelligence. As I said, I've come from linguistics, So a lot of people are saying, like, what is the structure of language? It isn't necessarily about some practical means of automating machine translation to understand what the Ruskies are saying, right? Though that might have been the way in which the funding came, right? The like U.S. government, military, whoever we're talking about, they might have funded automated translation research, or like Alan Turing cracking Enigma code. That might have been the reason why the people with the big bucks funded particular research. But I think that it is fair for Reaper to say, especially with the AI researchers themselves, maybe they were, like he says, super academic science people. So maybe those people themselves were not so much interested in, how do I produce more widgets. My claim would be, though, that people who are interested in funding these things, then the people funding these things might be interested in more widgets, and then you might get pure academic types that are getting into it not because they care about widgets, but because they're interested in like programming language, representational systems, all these things. So I think Reaper, we're probably not in a disagreement about this, and I think you bring up a good point here. All right, continuing. These conditions were not found in the other European countries, so not Great Britain and France. So, for example, he lists Spain, Italy, Germany, Austria, Russia. Jacques Ellul continues, in these nations, the social structures remained as they were, and the social hierarchy was not attacked. The taboos of religion were fanatically respected, and those of society were not questioned. The Inquisition and the Tribunal of the Empire jealously guarded the spiritual and sociological divisions of society. The world was already undermined, ruined, and emptied of content, but its rigid forms were universally accepted as good. There were few changes in the cities and none at all in the rural areas. The traditional organism remained intact, and when enlightened despotism began to create some excitement, the world was so little prepared that it exhausted itself in the struggle against old social structures. Consider, for example, the fate of Peter the Great, Joseph II, and the melancholy and celebrated Marquis de Pombal. Great invention may have been made in Germany and Russia during this period. Everyone is familiar with the claims of Hitler and later of Stalin, and all important discoveries were made in their respective countries. Allowed for exaggeration, there is perhaps some truth in these claims, but the discoveries were not applied, and only application counts in the rise of technique. Application did not take place because the felicitous combination of factors we have discussed was lacking. The social milieu of these countries, their spiritual tendencies, group psychology, sociological structures, and past history were all unfavorable to the rise of technique. The state in some countries, principally Prussia, was favorable to it, but a clear technical consciousness on part of the state alone was obviously insufficient to open the door to the great mobilization of men and things necessary for this multiform progress. All right, turning to the comments, Reaper has a couple things to add. He says, emphasis on some end goal of increasing efficiency. One example of Emacs funding is this document, and I'm going to click on this suspicious link. Hope it doesn't blow up my computer. Reaper says, Supercomputer Workstation Communication, SWC project. The project explored new techniques for using high-capacity networks to communicate between personal workstations and remote supercomputers, DARPA, NSF, and others, right? So I think network technology and stuff has been big. Okay, so the document Reaper sent me is about this supercomputer workstation communication. Maybe we'll have to look at this later or get some more knowledgeable opinions about this old technology. But I think, it goes without saying that a lot of the technology stuff, right, it is related to efficiency in business, IBM, like business machines. So to be more efficient in business operations, to do calculations, to make things more efficient, Let's see. Reaper says it looks that it was common for Emacs to be used in research projects because how extensible it was, and core to programmers' existing lives. ELIS would be a great lab environment, etc. Okay, so now Reaper's making some comments about this famous text editor that I listed as an example of something that is practically useless in the modern era, though fun to use and play around with. The Emacs editor. And it sounds like we could think of it kind of similarly to how nowadays there are certain things that are just everywhere. Like if you can't use a browser, modern browser, Google Chrome, Firefox, something like that, on a machine, then people might be like, is it even a computer? So maybe in the past eras, you could kind of look at Emacs equivalently, where if Emacs was just a tool that was available everywhere, and to do things to be used with Emacs, just like now everything has to be a web app, that maybe Emacs was something like a predecessor to that. We could look at history of Emacs and stuff later, get some more title a stream specifically for that, and get some nerds to get some really juicy interesting takes on this, because perhaps not a general audience topic, but something I would like to learn more about. Alright, we're almost done. Let's finish. So Jacques Ellul continues, the joint occurrence of the 5 factors we have briefly analyzed explain the exceptional growth of technique. Never before had these factors coincided. They are, to summarize: 1. A very long technical maturation or incubation without decisive checks before the final flowering. 2. Society growth. 3. A suitable economic milieu. 4. The almost complete plasticity of a society malleable and open to the propagation of technique. And 5. A clear technical intention, which combines the other factors and directs them towards the pursuit of the technical objective. Some of these conditions had existed in other societies, for example, the necessary technical preparation and the destruction of taboos in the Roman Empire in the 3rd century, but the unique position was the simultaneous existence of all 5, all of them necessary to bring about individual technical invention, the mainspring of everything else. What else can history teach us? Only the vanity of believing we can impose our theories on history. Any philosophy which asserts that human experience repeats itself is ineffectual. Alright, so we get a little meta blurb about history and what humans can and can't do. And I guess part of a lot of non-fiction type works is you can't just describe stuff. You're supposed to make a thesis, kind of make some claim that people could argue about, discuss, cite you, say that you're an idiot, say that they love what you're saying. So Jacques Ellul does that in a point-by-point manner, bringing up 5 individual facts. And I'm not being paid to write a journal article response about him or anything. So we will not go point by point and look at the specifics of these and what we agree with or disagree. But that's to say, I think that it has been quite a good discussion here, looking at Jacques Ellul and what he's claiming about technology and the parallels that we're seeing in more recent history, the rise of Silicon Valley, .com bubble, all that stuff, and then echoed again with all the metaverse stuff. So, yes, I would say I am intrigued. I am willing to continue to go through the technological society. We got through chapter 1, and it took many episodes, but I'm willing to go on to chapter 2. So that's the tentative plan, unless I got major outcry contrary. And I think we could continue to talk about things like Emacs and cultural things like Star Wars, all this stuff. It's about us reading and studying a work, Jacques Ellul, The Technological Society, and every generation has to take the time to read or interpret a work to make it useful for them. Books sitting on the bookshelf and not be read, they don't do nothing. So that's why we're here today, and hopefully for future streams discussing these things. All right, I want to just thank everybody who took the time to come visit the stream. I hope you had a good time. It's been very educational for me, and I think tentatively this 3:30 p.m. it seems like a decent time where a lot of people, even if they can't make the beginning or the end, a lot of people could stop by. So tentatively I'll continue to plan for 3:30 p.m. Pacific time. And with that being said, I'll close out the stream. Thanks everybody who joined today, and I hope to see you again in the not too distant future.